So I'm used to, when I'm writing about something, thinking about something, having the children I work with, and even the adults to some extent, bring it up in their play more than ever. When I wrote about snakes for a journal, every sand scene in my office that week or two was filled with snakes. And the same thing is true of dragons or meteors or cyclops or Medusa. But this week what happened is nature seemed to be in sync. So I was writing about storms, and when we left our house in upstate New York, it was one of the worst thunderstorms we've had. And storms followed us to the airport, which delayed our flight. And when we were flying into Madrid, they warned us that thunderstorms were happening. It didn't happen, but so there's something about the synchronicity of this that's very moving. I don't totally understand it, but it says a lot about the collaborative creative process that goes into therapy. So what I want to talk about today is how to help children be less afraid of themselves, of that which lives within them as emotion and impulse and fantasy. I want to share an approach to therapy which is body-centered and imagination-driven, and that uses play as a vehicle. Every child longs to be able to both express and regulate their emotions and impulses. This innate desire combined with children's need to play and play's innate ability to enable children to change makes it possible to help them. This was true 40 years ago when I first started practicing, and is true today despite the complexity of the world children live in and the problems they develop. It's often possible to find the underpinning of the problem as well as the potential for its resolution within the energy and imagery of the symptoms that bring children into treatment. The impulsive movements, the tantrums, the dysregulation that disturbs others and disrupt the child can have a curative and positive energy and meaning embedded within the impulses. The phobic child may use the energy and imagery of their phobia to eliminate the phobia, and they will emerge in better health than they were prior to the phobia's onset. The traumatized child may manifest symptoms and movements in their play that speak of both the trauma and the resolution of the trauma. The intensity of the presenting symptoms often makes the problem easier to reconcile. So much energy is going into the organism's impulse to heal, manifesting as symptoms. The child who enters treatment with a vast array of symptoms may be easier to help due to this vast array. The organism is speaking very loudly about its dysfunction. In the child, this can be a sign that the organism has an innately strong life force that will not be thwarted without crying out via symptoms. Even the most severe symptoms are often directly related to what is thwarting the child as well as their desire to resolve it. In fact, the approach to play therapy I want to share with you today may be most helpful with the most problematic children. The one who's throwing chairs in school or panicking at night or refusing to go to school. It helps to understand and address the external causes of the problem as well as the internal causes. And the details of the symptoms can help with this. It helps to know what the child's parents or caregivers might do or not do that would help the child and help us help the child. Assessing if the child's own neurology in the form of learning or sensory issues or other neurologically based problems is the root is very important. But both in diagnosing and treating these problems, play is the way. I'm more and more interested in looking for the moments in play when a point of entry into the crux of the problem is revealed, when the child's defense system structure is open to being restructured, or when a deep wound may be healed or ruptured life may be made whole. The more I anticipate these moments, the more easily they arise. So in preparation for the storm, before we descend into the inner world of the child, I want to lead you on a guided visualization to a more elemental place. So if you would close your eyes for a moment. Close your eyes and settle into your chair. Take some belly breaths, focusing a little more on the exhale than the inhale. So imagine that you're standing on a path by the sea. There are no buildings, just earth and sky and sea. The air is warm and dry. There is a slight breeze, and in the distance, a mountain looms. As we begin to walk along the path slowly, use your senses to orient yourself to this imagined place. See if you can relax into the experience by deepening your breathing more, letting each exhale be a letting go. First, notice what you see. The sea is blue-green, may have small white caps. There may be a few ancient olive trees along the path, as well as some other small shrubs. Notice the feel of the sun and the breeze on your skin, and the solidity of the ground beneath your feet. Notice the smell of the sea and the aromatic herbs. And perhaps there's a taste of salt from the breeze as well, and the sound of the waves and the wind accompanying us as well as we walk. Now the mountain is near, and we walk together and sit by it. You'll settle into your seat. It could be on the sand, on a stone. Get comfortable. The sea is on our right, the mountain's on our left. And there's a cave opening into the mountain. See if you can feel a mix of excitement and curiosity about this cave. No danger, just a sense of mystery. And in slowly opening your eyes, see if you can bring the atmosphere of this place with you. So a few ideas. The paradox of play. Paradox, from the Greek meaning beyond thinking, implies the combining of two seemingly opposite and incompatible things towards a positive end. It's this very opposition that may allow for transcendence or change and freedom. Carl Jung said that only the paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life. So if you're like someone who thinks in black and white, it's a very disturbing thought. Winnicott talks about paradox and urges the therapist working with children to tolerate rather than attempt to resolve the paradox. And the most useful definition of play for our purposes today is paradoxical. Plato saw the model of true play in the need of all young creatures, animal and human, to leap. To truly leap, you must learn how to use the ground as a springboard, how to land resiliently and safely. It means to test the leeway allowed by given limits, to outdo and yet not escape gravity. Thus, wherever playfulness prevails, true playfulness prevails, there is always an element of surprise, surpassing mere repetition or habit. At its best, suggesting some virgin chance conquered, some divine leeway shared. So keep this definition in mind going forward, as it will make more sense in the context of cases in children's drawings. A few more things to consider before we enter the child's play world. Okay. The child mind. Children look at this painting by Chagall that hangs in my office and often tell me that it's exactly how they think. They're surprised that an adult has depicted it so clearly. For children think in images, and the narratives that these images describe are never linear. What this painting depicts is both movement and narrative, or the potential for narrative in the image. So if we offer the child a play environment and materials and a process in which they can move freely and express themselves in images, they will be able to be more fully articulate. What they say via moving and imagining may be very profound. The energetic underpinning to this work. The child experiences life first and foremost through their bodies, their senses. This schema of the personality by Alexander Lowen is helpful to consider when we attempt to communicate with a child in their language. The basis of all human structures are the energetic processes that activate us, such as respiration, peristalsis, the beating of the heart. These processes express themselves through movements which give rise to feelings that result in thoughts. Ego arises out of the interplay of these. The play therapy process is profoundly physical, visceral experience for the child who is truly engaged. Sitting by a deep sandbox, when a child manipulates the sand, they often begin to sweat, to pass gas, and to even pant. They may rise up from the box looking like they've been leaping around the room, and in fact they have. Symptoms. The symptoms that children bring into treatment are not the problems. They are a manifestation of the problem whose function is to alert both the individual and their caregivers that something is wrong. In that way, they are necessary and often brilliant expression of the organism's desire to get help, resolving whatever is causing imbalance. This could be in the child's family system or the child's own neurological processing. It could be an undiagnosed medical condition or a learning disability. It could be abuse or trauma of some sort. In all these situations, the symptoms are vital to healing, and they often contain what is needed to heal as energy, movement, or imagery. If we accept that what the child is entering treatment with is usable, albeit in need of transformation, then therapy begins the moment the child enters the play space. The roles of the therapist. This is something that would take a day to present thoroughly, but I'm giving it to you in 2 sentences. The therapist plays certain roles to facilitate change. They are witnessing, containing, mirroring, envisioning, and provoking. And the last one, in some ways, is perhaps one of the most untalked about roles of the therapist. And play is in and of itself provoking to the child. Even the play configurations they create provoke them. So it's not always that necessary to be provocative, but it is important to offer play configurations that are provocative and materials that are potentially provocative, helping things fall apart. When play is therapeutic, there is often a disorganization and reorganization of the child's defense system that occurs, which is visible in the child's play configurations and their body organization as well. I call this helping things fall apart in the service of ego. The child experiences this with delight. It may happen in the deep sandbox in which they create and then demolish and then recreate worlds. This type of play often has an immediate positive effect on the child's behavior and mood. It may happen using art materials such as clay or drawing. It may happen via moving play, but the need to have things fall apart in the service of growth is a key. So what I really want to talk about is monsters today. It does seem to always come back in my work to monsters. The doorway and the key, both, in many ways, for working with children. From my first session 40 plus years ago, children brought one consistent thing into the play space, and that was monsters. They imagined them under their beds or in their closets or lurking outside their windows or their doors, or they were in their dreams. These imagined beings seemed to be, to me, to be the child's first creative act. Part impulse, part deity, part mystery. Intuitively, monsters seemed like a language that I could speak with children, and in doing so, they responded. I actually had a dream before I started practicing therapy. When I was about 18, I just started dancing and studying dance therapy. And in the dream, I was in my childhood home, and in the room next to me was something monstrous. I couldn't see it, didn't know what it was, but it was terrifying. And I saw that there was an open door and I could leave. And in the dream, as I was leaving, I realized that whatever that monstrous thing was a part of me, which was not a very wonderful thing to realize at 18. But basically, the process of my own work on myself and with children has been to help them integrate the disconnected parts of themselves. That's what this is about. So early on, I began in my first visit with a child to ask them to imagine they drunk a magic potion and turned into a monster. Sometimes I do that, often do that actually within the first 5 minutes of children coming in. It's a way of them introducing themselves to me and me introducing themselves to the possibilities in this relationship. And this is an example of a child who probably 25 years ago came in, very, very intense kid who was spending a lot of time in school in the principal's office for starting fights. And he was so delighted to know that this part on the left of him had a place that it could bring itself. To invite the child to become a monster invites the whole child into the space, their fury, their fear, their impulses, their barely formed sense of the world and its hugeness. Even the most timid child has always been delighted to draw themselves as a monster in their first visit. Even children who've had monstrous things happen to them have been relieved to be invited to turn into one and to place this on the wall of my office. I think this opening gesture can become a portal to change. If the whole child is allowed to enter, then nothing is rejected. The potential for them to become integrated is present, even if it takes many, many experiences to realize this. Because the monster is an exaggeration of impulses that many children have, this exaggerated form can be curative. The basic human instincts are embodied in monsters: hunger, aggression, sexuality, creativity, even spirituality. The early Greek gods, the Titans, were all monsters. For those of you who've seen the film A Monster Calls, you will know exactly what I mean. In that movie, it's the hugeness of the monster that mirrors the hugeness of the child's emotions that allows him to heal. And not without making quite a mess. Very important word in this process is being able to make a mess. And if we follow those roles of the therapist I mentioned, the mess will not be uncontrollable. So I don't have kids come into my office ever and sweep all the miniatures off my shelf. I don't have kids come in and take sand and fling it around the room. I'm always waiting for that to happen because I hear it happen so often. But I think when children know, as they enter the space, that they can bring that mess with them, they use the material to express it in a way that works for them, as opposed to a way that disturbs me. Again, because the monster is an exaggeration of emotion and impulse, and because it lives beyond the laws of society, but not the laws of nature, it can help the child reconcile many things. It's always a good beginning. For many children, this drawing is like the leap that Plato speaks of, both defying and affirming the ground the child lives on. Monsters as portals. The idea of portals is one that children relate to, and many an adult in treatment has dreamt near the onset of treatment of finding a door in their home that leads to an unknown wing or series of rooms or underground labyrinth, parts of the self yet to be discovered. For the adult, these doorways offer the potential of finding a new way forward. One 6-year-old began treatment in a state of profound regression. He had first been going to the bathroom in his pants, but then he had stopped going to the bathroom at all. And before hospitalizing, his doctor suggested play therapy. When invited to become a monster, he first looked around my space, checking out the possibilities it offered, and then he drew himself as a key monster. He then proceeded, almost immediately, to use the bathroom near my playroom. He then drew a heart next to the monster and told me it was the key to the heart, and told me that I needed to take care of it. His key monster had opened the doorways to new energies that moved him forward into life. He went on to experiment with other manifestations of this new energy, experiencing both healthy aggression in the service of growth. It was important for his parents and his teachers to tolerate a child who was now aggressive instead of regressive. But because of the severity of the symptoms, everybody was willing to do that. Very, again, important. The severity of the symptom can be very, very important. This child was in such trouble that everyone said, we'll make room for this new child. For the child traumatized by years of parental discord to depict himself as a bloody pulp, as horrific as it may seem, was a relief. Again, the paradox of play is such that the child could depict himself as such and yet feel joy in doing so. And his parents saw this drawing at the end of the session, and they woke up a little bit to the effect they were having on their child. The image saying more than any words that I or he could convey. So that by the next visit, he no longer felt bloody, but rather enlivened. This monster, you can't quite read it. I often ask children to describe what power their monster has. This monster scared the poop out of parents that were fighting. And it actually has glitter on it, which you can't see in this. Or the girl that had been sexually abused depicted a monster that, like herself, was oozing with toxins, using this as a paradigm for playful negative discharge, pounding with every part of her body to discharge what lay there, howling with rage as she did so. When her next monster showed up, it was well armored, unavailable to assault. Obviously, at some point she needed to discard the spikes that were on her body. But this was an important step for her to feel a sense of self-protection. The child beaten down by parental battling and a molestful older brother who entered the play space in our first session with stooped shoulders and misery in his eyes found expressing himself as a monster to be liberating as he experimented with externalizing some of the sadistic impulses and feelings his parents and brother had filled him with, and that he was turning on himself. He slowly but surely became bigger, taking up more space in his body and in the world he lived in. And he left after just one session, standing taller and feeling heard. Of course, the parents had to stop battling and needed help to do so, and the older brother had to get help to deal with his problems as well. But the child's expanding through cathartic play went a long way to helping the family to change. Storm phobias. It's not that I've worked with so many storm phobias, maybe a dozen, but they seemed for this keynote to be an important thing to talk about because they kind of encapsulate the essence of dynamic play therapy. These are children who become terrified of thunderstorms, which eventually leads to fear of rain and then cloudy skies. It often leads to fear of sunny days, as several of these children told me, you never know. They'd become housebound, unable to go to school or out to play. And despite the severity of the symptoms, or perhaps because of it, they were able to resolve their phobias very quickly. In my first meeting, I invited each child to become a storm in my office. This involved having them leap around, rolling on the ground, making lots of thunder and lightning sounds. I would accompany them with percussion instruments, drums, rattles, and marimba. I also have a small device made out of a cylinder and a spring that, when shaken, sounds like thunder and lightning. I would begin these storm dances by assuring the child that by becoming the storm, they would master their fear of them. And it has always worked so far. And actually, even with a 6-year-old, it felt important to assure them that storming would help. When a child is that immobilized, so they won't even go out on a sunny day, I think it helps to have some words of assurance. Certainly it helps the parents to know that there is something in the storm that will help them tolerate the storm. And it's interesting that storm in Spanish is tormenta. I've been thinking a lot about that for these children. The dances were very intense, they did. A mixture of catharsis, but also of joy. Often by session 3, the phobia was totally gone or had abated largely. Why? And this does apply to most phobias. It applies to some extent to panic disorders. The family situations all these children came from were different, but all these children were more intense than their parents, or more intense than their parents acted. In many cases, their parents were pretty intense, but it had become suppressed. So there was a lack of mirroring for the fullness of their intensity, Was this the issue? These were also children, to a large extent, who'd never gone through the so-called terrible twos, the age at which children begin to assert themselves using the word no, often to great excess, but a crucial stage. More about this later. It's as if the thunderstorm mirrored the child's own undeveloped no, with its loud wildness, its insistence. The symptom and its severity forced the child's family again to make room for a child who was louder and more expressive than they would have preferred. I always warn parents that that will probably happen. And again, because the child is housebound, just like the child who's not going to the bathroom, there's an agreement immediately that, okay, we will make room for this child. And it's interesting, in almost all cases, the mother of these children was a very suppressed storm. And in seeing her child be able to tolerate her own intensity, their own intensity, they changed. What is a storm? The forces of nature intensified. The images that children use in their play are not that different than the images that adult patients dream about. Tidal waves, tornadoes, hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, meteor showers, events that alter form. Children play with these potent images and use them to alter their own defense systems. That is the difference. I mean, many adult patients, not most, have dreams, especially before they begin treatment, either of the two big ones are tornadoes with men and tidal waves with women, although there's some overlap. And it's interesting to think about what I'm saying today in terms of that, because they too benefit from a need to integrate that image into their lives. And for them also, the woman who spent her life running away from tidal waves in her dream, when she comes to see that the tidal wave is her tidal wave, it changes things. The dreams often shift to instead of being pursued by the tidal wave, or she's being pursued by the tidal wave, but it's following her through a town. It's not bothering anyone else. So it makes it easier for her to see that this wave belongs to her. Children seem to get this very quickly. This child accepted very quickly that the storm she was afraid of was her storm. We didn't talk about it a lot. So this was her first monster after she began to storm. Materials of play. This is a picture, a little fuzzy, of my sandbox in my office. In my play space, I have many materials. Clay, paints, blocks, dollhouse balls, puppets, a small trampoline, paper airplanes, foam bats for fighting, and many other items. But the centerpiece of my play is a deep sandbox. I started practicing sand play before Dora Kauf's book about sand play was available in the States, and I didn't know that you were supposed to use the very shallow box. So I used the deep box. And initially, I used a very big deep box, but over time, the dimensions changed based on what I saw children doing. So these dimensions seem to really work for the child and or for me. It's really the centerpiece of my office. Even when it's not being used by children, it has an effect. Like the cave opening in the guided visualization, the deep box is an enticing and mysterious presence that is both empty and full. The deep box, like the cave, is full of possibilities. Most of you familiar with sand play? Yes, no? Okay. In my office, the box is on the floor so that the child sits or kneels by it. Feels very important, although that idea of it being important has come out of working with kids. It wasn't my intention to put it on the floor because it was important, but the child lowering their center of gravity to the floor and then putting their hands into this deep sand, again, has an almost immediate visceral physiological effect. Even before a child makes a world in it, they begin to drool sometimes. They begin to sweat, they begin to pant, they definitely begin to pass gas, they sometimes have to run and use the bathroom. Something has been stirred up just by opening the sand with their hands. When it's deep enough, things can sink or they can emerge. This descent-ascent process is a large part of the power it has for children. Things can be lost or discovered, buried or unearthed. The child's narrative can descend into the underworld or be elevated to the top of a mountain. The creation of caves or tunnels, where'd I go? Allows for further deep exploration. For children who have experienced loss, it allows for better dealing with descent into the earth or ascent into the heavens that death entails. This was a first sand world of a boy whose father had died when he was very young. He spent a lot of his life battling his mother because of his father's absence. But in this sand world, he's entering the underworld. And through it, this boy began to encounter his own grief. He didn't find his father. Well, he found his father dead, so he was able to really grieve instead of raging at his mother. When we spent a lot of time in the underworld after this. But this was the first indication it was where we were going. And it looks a little gruesome. It was not gruesome. It was quite beautiful. They are real bones that some child gave me long ago. Let's see what's next. This is kind of we're at the above world in this. But the above world in this case is also a place in which a boy who was very dysregulated started to find balance. These samurais, he was a real fighter, climbed their way to the top of this mountain. And when they got there to take this orb, a dragon was there. Now the boy who made this world, this is very typical of kids, was surprised that they found a dragon there, even though he placed it there. He was so identified with the samurai that he was shocked. It was as if I had put it there, and I had to remind him that he had. This world, that came after a lot of very intense moving play, weeks and weeks and weeks, really brought a shift in his own experience of himself. Him placing the dragon there began to create balance, despite it seeming like a symbol of imbalance. Often children playing in the sand are simply exploring the possibilities for self-expression and self-exploration. This can be therapeutic too, but at some point, if we're lucky, the sand process takes on a charge. Not sure how to describe it, except that it seems in those moments that if I had a machine that could do this, a device, it would register that something intense was happening. 2 minutes before, it was just an empty sandbox. Suddenly, something's happening there that is palpable. It could be that it leads to something like this, but almost regardless of what's happening, when the sand world is charged, it's as if the whole child, it's as if the child's psyche is in the box. It's not simply a manifestation of the psyche, but the psyche is there. And I would say even in those moments, their neurology is there. Their whole being is there. So if they if those moments when that happens, if they reorganize the world, or recognize, as this boy did, something dynamic and a dynamic potential for balance, it makes sense that they might, as he did, stand up different than they were when they fell down to it. Natural disasters as healing. While I was preparing for this talk, let's see, 10-year-old boy with a severe eating disorder began treatment. Again, this is a wonderful synchrony of preparing to present this to you in this boy's process. He was very bright and very rigid and felt that he had no imagination. He suspected that his rigidity might be part of his eating problem, and he was right. Initially, when the word food was mentioned, he would begin to weep. But after a short while, his response turned to anger. I would mention a strawberry, and he would begin to feel enraged. The no that is expressed in the symptom of refusing to eat was beginning to show itself. He began to engage in aggressive play with me and also spent time each week seeing how high he could leap into the air. Initially, he said he was practicing for basketball, but what was clear was that this boy's leaping, go back to Plato's definition, brought him great joy. And for a moment in the leap, he was not in the rigid structure that his psyche had created. It was as if you were seeing him leap above it and then leap back down, and because, as Plato says, in landing from the leap, you experience the ground more. Your knees bent. That was part of what his sessions with me were like week by week. He also created a sequence of worlds in the sandbox that once they became charged, reflected and helped the changes that took place. See if you can imagine as you're sitting there that you are a rigid child who has been starving himself, as I share this sequence. Take a few breaths. First, he depicted a meteor crashing into Earth that freed up animals that had been trapped below the ground. See if you can sense what that feels like. Especially the child who's been saying no, using his metabolism, his organism. He was very surprised by this. Again, he made it, he was surprised. How did that meteor get there that he put in? As if it happened without him making it. He was also amazed to learn from me that when giant meteors hit the Earth, they bring up to the surface rare minerals buried below. He was very moved by this. Next, he depicted a giant whirlpool in which a giant whirlpool that sucked everyone into its mouth, including the hero, who managed to somehow emerge intact. He was very amazed to know that there was in fact a famous hero, Odysseus, who also had to go to the bottom of a whirlpool and did and survived. This idea of his process reflecting natural history and mythic story was very reassuring to him. He felt that what he was doing, even his symptoms, even if his problem, had a basis in history. If there was a myth about this, then how much bigger and in some ways better his struggle was. Next week, a tidal wave came in which everything was destroyed but the hero and an ally of his. I wondered if it was me in that moment. We managed to survive by going below the level of the wave. And the next week, he depicted a volcanic eruption in which the hero leapt into the volcano, which then became a portal to another dimension. In this dimension, everything was upside down. This is a frequent image that arises at some point in working with children with eating disorders. The world is upside down, which makes sense as their orientation to life is upside down. This 10-year-old boy was starving himself at an age when most 10-year-old boys are beginning to be voracious eaters. When the hero came back through the portal to his own world, he had to look at himself in a mirror and ask himself, who am I? I'm not making that up, that was him. But he was very moved by it. Again, in the process of imaginative play, the child is both the experiencer and even in some way the witness. During this period of several weeks of charged sand play, he began to feel hungry, and he began to eat more and then more. The natural disasters depicted combined with his leaping had a curative effect on his psyche, his metabolism. The externalization of the no, combined with the form-altering power of his imagination, became a pathway out of stasis. On occasion, I have let children who were sexually abused make a volcano in the deep sandbox and light a candle in the bottom. And at the right moment in treatment, I would let them make their abuser out of paper and throw him or her into the volcano. This is the sand world of two brothers whose father had molested them. And when they were ready, this was not in the first session by any means, the two of them came together, and this was a profoundly moving session to witness. It was not done carelessly. They spent a long time making their father. They spent a long time preparing for his incineration, and they were very moved by this. It had a very positive, profound effect on them. Not something that too many therapists would do, but I don't have a sprinkler system in my office, so this didn't send off any alarms to my landlord. This is called Tornado in a Box. A very dysregulated 6-year-old who kept being removed from school for throwing tantrums and shoving children around, came to play. I had a very hard time initially with this kid finding a connection. He just wandered around my play space, checked things out, and nothing seemed to interest him, except his body would sometimes do odd things. He'd suddenly do a roll or a backwards roll without even realizing he'd done it. So there was these moments of disruption that were actually rather beautiful in some ways. They weren't so dysregulated, but he didn't seem aware that it was happening. After several sessions of this unfocused exploratory play, he sat in my sandbox and he announced to me that he was going to become a tornado. I expected, for the first time, sand to fly everywhere, but he sat very still, probably for about 10 minutes. He sat still, this very active boy, sat still in my sandbox. At the time, because I had a lot of time to free associate, it reminded me of a hexagram in the I Ching. I don't know why it reminded me. It seemed like there was such a potency in this image of this boy being a tornado, but a tornado that was very contained by the box in the sand and the relationship. When he stepped out of the box, he seemed different. His teacher described him initially as tornado-like in school, and yet after he became a tornado in the box, he seemed more centered. This was followed by a long period in school of no tantrums and no shoving. I didn't see him. I had no idea why that had changed things because I felt somehow uninvolved in the process. I didn't invite it. I didn't think I'd provoked it. All I did was witness it, but it seemed to have an effect for a while. And then, after a few months, he started shoving kids in school again. He wasn't tantrum anymore, but he was starting to shove. And so, before I even saw him, I heard that shove as a usable symptom. So when he came in the next time, and the next several times, I have a large ball, and I had him spend a lot of the time shoving the ball at me, using his hands, using his head, using his feet. This seemed to really engage him. It may have been the first time he and I were having a relationship. And after several sessions of this shoving, he came and sat in the box again. It was a tornado in the box, and this time he had me take a dragon and place it on his head. After this, I didn't see him again. I'm assuming that he's doing okay. Clay. Clay may be the best material for the expression of negative aggression in cathartic play. This is in part because of the capacity for the expression of fury that can turn into a creative act, often simultaneously. It can be pounded, smeared, chopped, and then reshaped, facilitating the disorganization, reorganization form that I find so therapeutic. It's also very physical and very visceral. A 5-year-old boy who had been sexually abused and neglected, both, began treatment in a state of profound dissociation, such that it was really difficult for him to play. He was plagued by a fear of zombies. Eventually, initiated by him, we made zombies and he chopped their heads off using a small guillotine. He had me make the heads and try to connect them afterwards, by having the heads reconnect to their body, which he assured me would really cause a big problem. They would be stronger if this happened. So he had done something that had the potential to make his fears worse or help resolve them. Then he would hammer the heads flat using a rubber mallet I have. He repeated this hundreds of times over several weeks, expressing both great terror and great delight alternately. I can't convey the combination of emotional intensity and levity in this play. Talk about paradox. He really alternately would shriek with fear at the possibility that the zombie's head might come back and absolute delight at smashing it. And the same child had me make a monster out of clay for him that had an opening into the mouth, the genitals, and the anus. And this monster was forced to swallow poison that would flush out through his body. It's an interesting image if you think about this abused child. Although it was a monster that was being poisoned, it was both a monster and it was both himself. It was the monster that he felt like from what had happened. when he would do this, I would always get wet and he would never get wet. It was very strange. We sat next to each other, but I managed to get the flood of this monster, and which felt very important. Felt important that I was forced to get wet by this process. And it's interesting, at some point, when he was done with it, he hammered this monster that had been around for many, maybe months, flat with a mallet, and he apologized for having got me wet. There was suddenly an acknowledgement of what that process had been. After this, he became truly able to play by exploring the other possibilities. Up till then, certain kids, when they come in who are traumatized, don't seem to notice what's in the space. Either they become monofocused on one thing and are surprised to discover there are many other things, or in this child's case, he was so dissociated that this allowed him to begin to associate. That makes sense. And when he associated, he started to really be there. So he discovered I had a sandbox. He went to the sandbox after this and made a very interesting world in it. But I'll tell you about that later. So the other thing this boy did was he would hide. This was after this monster was smushed. He would hide behind a trampoline that I have and have me throw objects at the trampoline that would bounce off. And he did this for many, many weeks, and it brought him enormous joy. It seemed to me at the time that he was beginning to develop a better sense of filter. Alexander Lowen was the first psychologist that I know of who talked about filter as a means of describing the antidote to ineffectual muscular and emotional arming. And I think it's one of the most important concepts in working with children. It's now a term neurologists use to describe what is lacking in children with poor impulse control. The ultimate filter, though, is developing the capacity for a healthy no. Saying no is our first effort at establishing self-regulation. The filter develops when the child begins to say no to what they don't want, the so-called terrible twos. Again, most of the children, not all of the children I've worked with at 8 or 9 or 10 were phobic or panicking, had not gone through the terrible twos. Something I always ask parents immediately when one of these child comes in, what were they like at 2? And I always know they're going to say, oh, he was an angel, or she was an angel. By saying no to what they don't want, they begin to create an emotional and energetic membrane that protects and defines them. If it's too rigid, the child is imprisoned by it. Too porous, then the child is easily overwhelmed. But no is the key. This works hand in hand with the concept of grounding, in which healthy contact with the ground allows the child to tolerate more feelings, more sensations, like a surge breaker in electronics. Developing a grounded filter helps the child both tolerate and regulate excitation. Again, think back to Plato's definition of play in which leaping affirms gravity. How am I doing time-wise? Okay? So I want to say just one thing before I get into this. Motion and emotion, structural or moving play, which includes battling, throwing balls or paper airplanes at each other, or spontaneous play. This allows us to better see how a child hangs together, how they articulate themselves physically, how they connect with others while doing it. For many children, having a chance to fully throw themselves into movement with no limits can itself reorganize things. Having a child throw something as hard as they possibly can without any negative ramifications, because there aren't any. Throwing clay at a table, throwing a ball at a wall, throwing a paper airplane, as different as those seem material-wise, to be able to do it intensely, again and again and again. For many children, as you're watching them, you begin to see something shift. It's as if the child who has sensory motor integration disorder is beginning to integrate their senses and their movement. Not always. But that's something that, and again, the exciting thing about it is to be able to witness the organism changing before your very eyes. Again, in unrestricted movement, they might find balance, they may encounter their core. I think this is happening in the context of a therapeutic relationship is key. I often challenge children to contests, such as a hitting contest or a jumping or kicking contest. This gives me a format to better advise them ways of using their energy and allows children who are inhibited due to dysregulation, a chance to really let go. There are about 12 different contests going on in my office right now. And for the competitive child, girls as often as boys, that makes it even easier to step into the process. There are kids who would never lie down on my mattress and kick if there wasn't a kicking contest. And yet those kids often really benefit from it. I don't make them do it, but I do kind of provoke them, if I know they're that type of child, by simply saying there's a contest. Provided that the score doesn't get too high, which then discourages kids from entering. But I'm actually not opposed to lying about what the score is. They get to discharge the energy associated with negative emotions that are lingering in their body. Emotion has the word motion in it, and the body always wants to move when emotion is expressed. So, I want to end with this idea of the mythological perspective. Something that seems, in talking about seriously traumatized children, is superfluous, and yet it's not really something happening in the remote past, but they're eternal dramas that are living themselves out repeatedly in our own lives. Children love mythology. In fact, actually, I was never really that interested in Greek mythology until I started working with children. They would come and talk to me about Zeus or Poseidon and Artemis, and I started reading about them and understood why they were so appealing to them. And they show up in children's play and in their stories without children knowing who they are. So this is a young girl whose mother had abandoned her when she was little and left her to a father who was very cold. He was trying to be warm, but he was not terribly warm, and an older brother who was very mean. So her first monster was called Three Boobs. Her brother came in at the end of her session, saw it, and was disgusted that I had allowed her to do this, and he was also a little intimidated. He sensed, more than I did at the time, who this was that had shown up. In her second monster was Thousand Boobs. She'd never seen this image. This is a statue of Artemis. Artemis as the ultimate mother. Artemis, who was also the protector of young girls. She didn't know that. I didn't know that at the time. But that's who showed up. And she went on to work with an art therapist who worked with clay, so a female, so she had a bit of an Artemis figure to work with, which helped a lot. So before I did a PowerPoint, maybe 10, 12 years ago, I never really thought that much about the monsters. I accepted the monsters as a gift and as a portal, as a key, but I didn't spend too much time diagnosing what was happening. So I didn't realize until I put this PowerPoint together a decade ago how many boys in particular's first monsters were Cyclops. Really maybe in the first few, and then it stopped. And recently I started thinking more about why. Started thinking about the Cyclops as our original face, a la Zen, because there were so many Cyclopses showing up. And eventually I found some statues, really early statues from Greece of Cyclops. And if you look at these Cyclops, these are the early statues, what you notice is not one eye, but three. Two closed, one open. And I think there's something in this that is what boys are working with in this first monster as portal, as an expression not of dysregulation totally, but of the possibility of regulation. Cyclops, if you read it, there were three tribes of Cyclops. The first built the walls of Mycenae. First were builders. The second were forgers. They built Poseidon's trident and Zeus's thunderbolt. They were craftsmen. The third tribe were kind of wild shepherds. Polyphemus, the one from the Odyssey, for those of you who know that book, was one of those. In fact, Polyphemus means abundant in song. So these boys are the power of myth is very important. With girls, their first monsters are often Medusas. Rarely, maybe never has a boy made a Medusa as his first monster. And they vary, and this one's snakes are kind of coming out of her feet, hanging down as a skirt, but this one's kind of a combination of Medusa and exploding head. This is Caravaggio himself as Medusa. At this point, I was thinking of Medusa still in terms of the Greek myth in which Medusa is originally a very beautiful woman who is actually raped by a god in a temple to Athena and then punished for being raped in a god's temple, which is happening in the world today as we speak. Then her power, the power of her face, was to turn people to stone, which eventually, as you know, if you know the story, her head is chopped off and begins to be used as a weapon. But even in that Greek myth, what happens when her head is cut off is Pegasus emerges from her body. Pegasus, who stomps on the ground, and the spring of the muses emerges. So it started me thinking and looking, and the early underpinnings of Medusa go back to Kali and Durga, but they go ultimately back to an African goddess from the Rift Valley, which is where most of our DNA comes from. Very, very ancient. And this, I think, is the Medusa girls are working with. This is Kali, whose tongue licks up the blood of the demons that she's destroyed. So she really is Shakti, female wisdom. In fact, the name in Greek, Meda means protector. In Egyptian, I think it means fairness, and in Sanskrit, it may also mean wisdom in Sanskrit. But there's something in the word Medusa that speaks of this. So I'm going to go through just a few quick monsters that speak for themselves. This was a girl who had a swallowing phobia, and she was starting to resolve her phobia by vomiting out the stuff in her life that had been unpalatable. This is a little sequence of a boy who, go back. Oop. This is his early perfectionistic state. He wanted children to think that this was drawn by a much older kid, which they did. And his monsters started to fall apart. And when they regrouped, this was his monster. This is a girl's first monster, a very chaotic child. And her second monster, the chaos is now in her chest, but she's not swirling around inside of it. It's a sequence of a girl who was referred for therapy. She was battling a very virulent form of stomach cancer and had surgery. Her surgeon felt that play therapy would help her battle off the potential for resurging. So this is kind of a Medusa, but it's her feet. She's kind of a sad Medusa-footed child. And her mother came into that session, and without looking at each other, they both drew Medusas of sorts. This is her second. And I wanted you to notice the movement of these, from session to session. So look at, just again, viscerally notice how you feel at how they expand and contract. So week by week, they tended to get bigger, and then they tended to get smaller, until they stayed big. And they got smaller again. This is her last monster that is a combination of all the monsters she drawn. It's kind of a monster collision, which is kind of a combination of expansion and contraction at the same time. So, as an ending, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this Reich's idea of pulsation, expansion and contraction. What happens in play when the child is engaged is the sand worlds or their drawings or their clay configurations or their movement tends to expand and contract. It tends to get bigger, sometimes spilling out of the box, and then come back in, sometimes forming a very tight center. It's kind of uncanny, and it doesn't have to happen in the sand, but I think it's a reflection of what's happening in the child when it does. Sometimes the sand worlds extend out to the whole office space, and then 2 or 3 weeks later they're contracted. this is kind of an interesting balance. So he's talking about expansion and contraction as how life force expresses itself. And in acupuncture, yin and yang are expansion and contraction. They're both important. One is not good and one's bad. It's necessary. I think the acupuncturist would say he is trying to reinstate a natural balance, or she, of expansion and contraction, of yin and yang. And certainly in bioenergetics and Reich's work, the effort was to release arm rings so that breath and body expanded and contracted more easily. The last monster is a girl who initially had been very, very out of control, tantruming, very frustrated by an undiagnosed reading disability. And this is her last monster, in which she is reading in the arms of her tree, which is also herself. So this is the last image I want you to see. Just to, you know, many of you probably know this Chinese painting. It's really called the giant wave. But if you notice, what's happening is the fishermen are not rowing away from it. They're rowing into it. So our job is to join the child in the boat heading straight into the giant wave, where the best fishing is. That's all I want to say. Thank you.